We've got a lot of videos and a lot of streams coming up over the next few days as we wrap up Olympic coverage and we watch the NFL preseason. So be sure that you turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live. And now, on with our feature presentation. When you think of the 1969 Kansas City Chiefs, and think of how great that Super Bowl champion team was, you probably think of that incredible defense that led the AFL by allowing just 12 points per game, that made the Minnesota Vikings look inept in the Super Bowl, and had all-stars and Hall of Famers left, right, and center. You think of great players like Hurley Culp, Bobby Bell, Buck Buchanan, Willie Lanier, Johnny Robinson, and Emmett Thomas, with that defense having a whopping 6 Hall of Famers in the starting lineup. So with that in mind, it's very easy for certain guys who are not Hall of Famers to slip through the cracks and be wildly underrated. And this man right here, well, he's Jim Kearney, and he might be the greatest safety in the history of professional football to never be named an All-Star or an All-Pro. Kearney was an absolute legend in Kansas City, especially during that 1969 season where he had 5 interceptions and even had a pick in the AFL Championship against the Oakland Raiders. He was a surefire tackler, an anchor in that secondary, and was an incredible player for a long period of time. It is a player that definitely does not get the due and the respect that he deserves, because even though he's largely been forgotten, he was exceptional. However, as great as he was during his incredible stint with the Chiefs, to say that he was done dirty at the end of his tenure would be an understatement. The Chiefs might be one of the model organizations in the game now, but during the late 1970s and into the 1980s, this was an organization that was anything but that. And the handling of Jim Kearney was a prime example of that. Because even though Kearney should have ended his career as a Chief, he ended it as a member of a very different team. And it's all because the Chiefs decided to backstab him and withhold information from him for no reason whatsoever. Because this is the story behind the tragic end to the great career of the late great Jim Kearney, and how he was lied to and was wronged by his organization. Before I talk about what exactly the Chiefs did to the man that you've been watching this whole time, and how they completely screwed him over, we need some context to understand just who Jim Kearney was, and how good and how important of a player he was for the Chiefs. After joining the Chiefs in 1967, following 2 seasons with the Detroit Lions in the NFL, Kearney became a critical part of Kansas City's defense, and became an anchor of that team for a long period of time, as without him, the Chiefs do not have the sustained success that they did throughout the late 60s and the early 1970s. Over his first 9 seasons with the Chiefs, Kearney started an incredible 115 games, and did not miss a single start since 1967. From 1968 to 75, Kearney started 112 out of a possible 112 games, showing insane longevity and consistency. For some perspective on how incredible that was, in terms of defensive backs, only one defensive back started all 14 games of the season for 8 straight seasons with the same organization from 1968 to 1975, and that player was none other than Jim Kearney. And it wasn't hard to see why he was starting all those games in a row, because he was a great player who was not only a good tackler, but was great at finding the ball and forcing turnovers. Kearney had 23 interceptions from 1968 to 73, and most notably in 1972, he had 5 interceptions while returning 4 of them for a touchdown. In 1972, Jim Kearney scored the 4th most touchdowns of any player on the Chiefs. And may I remind you, the man played defense. If he played on the Houston Oilers in 1972, Jim Kearney would have led the team in touchdowns, which is insane considering, once again, the man was a defender. Prior to Deron Bland's 2023 season with the Dallas Cowboys, this was the NFL record for most pick sixes in a single season. And for what it's worth, somehow, Kearney did not make the Pro Bowl that season, being the only player in NFL history to record 4 or more pick sixes in a single season and not make the Pro Bowl. How Kearney never made an All-Star game is legitimately baffling. Seriously, I was not exaggerating at the start of this video when I said that Kearney might be the greatest safety to never make the Pro Bowl. But now, the year was 1976, America's bicentennial. Kearney had been playing in professional football for over a decade by this point, and was going to enter his 12th season in the league at the age of 33 years old. He knew that he didn't have a whole lot left in the tank, and he knew that his play was starting to decline, which is natural for a safety in his mid-30s who had a lot of wear and tear on him, especially back then. So the plan for Kearney seemed to be simple on paper. He was going to play one more season in Kansas City, and then call it a career. Kearney had called Kansas City home for a decade by this point. He had a business that he ran during the off-season in the area, and he was going to live in Kansas City after retiring. So he was only going to play one more year under head coach Paul Wiggin, and then hang it up. Now, Kearney never vocalized this plan, these were just rumors, but the Chiefs had no indications of ever letting him walk or letting him go to another team, as head coach Paul Wiggin seemed to really like the man, as did everyone in the organization, with multiple reports coming out over the years calling him a model player. However, there was just one small problem facing the Chiefs in 1976, and that was a little thing called the expansion draft. In 1976, the NFL was expanding for the first time in nearly a decade, as the Seattle Seahawks and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were going to join the league. As was the case with just about any expansion draft, with the Seahawks and the Buccaneers well behind the eight ball in terms of needing to acquire talent, having to start from scratch, the NFL tried to help them out by means of the expansion draft, where each team would be allowed to select players from other teams in the league. Teams could protect a certain number of players, but they couldn't protect their entire roster, and they had to leave some players unprotected, which could either be acquired by the expansion team in question or not, in which case, those players would revert back to their original team. Simple enough, and if you've ever watched or followed an expansion draft, you know exactly how this process goes. Nothing crazy about it. So the Chiefs were faced with a decision of figuring out what players to protect and what players to leave unprotected on the open market for the Bucs or the Seahawks to acquire freely. And sure enough, they left none other than the man you've been watching this whole time, Jim Kearney, unprotected. Now I want to make it extremely clear before going any further. It is entirely Kansas City's right to leave Kearney unprotected. Football is not a charity, and at the end of the day, if protecting another player over Kearney gave the Chiefs the best chance to win games, then so be it. This is in no way whatsoever about Kearney being left unprotected in general, because you can bet that this was a hard decision. Having said that, do you want to know what the Chiefs did not do? You want to know what the Chiefs decided not to do during all of this? That's right. They never told Jim Kearney that they were leaving him unprotected. Not once did they end up giving him a phone call or a heads up to let him know that there was a possibility that he would end up on another team. Despite the fact that Kearney had been there for a decade and had started every game since 1968, despite the fact that Kearney was basically a Kansas City lifer and a staple on that team, and despite the fact that the organization clearly knew that Kearney was going to be retiring soon due to his age and declining performance, and that he had affairs in Kansas City regarding his business, the Chiefs never stopped to think for 1 second that it would be a good idea to let their franchise legend know that they were leaving him unprotected. I don't know. That seems like a pretty scummy thing to do if I work for a company and my place of employment could change without me knowing about it, and they don't give me a heads up that this could happen, especially if I'd been there for a decade. But, okay, this becomes a moot point if no one takes Kearney and he reverts back to the Chiefs. Again, it'd be nice to have the heads up, but if neither the Seahawks nor the Buccaneers claim this man right here, then it'd be a non-story and a non-problem. However, take a wild guess as to what happened, because of course it did. That's right, Jim Kearney got picked up in the expansion draft by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Chiefs just let their decade-long safety and franchise staple, the man who started every game in the secondary for the last 8 years, go in the expansion draft, and they never told the man. Head coach Paul Wiggin was stunned that the Buccaneers took Kearney in the first place, saying that this was never the plan, and saying, "We didn't think these teams would draft age players. We thought they would go for youth." Basically, we were gambling with that in mind. It's like a chess game. It's your logic against their logic. We gamble with it, especially in the case of Jim Kearney. I'll admit that. Now look, hindsight is 20/20, but come on, Paul. You seriously didn't think that these expansion teams would pick up veteran players? You seriously didn't think they'd do that? This is why Paul Wiggin was a bad head coach, because he should have seen this coming a mile away. Yes, the expansion teams are going to go for youth, but they're going to do it at this little thing called the NFL Draft, where they can get all the youth they so desire, especially with a treasure trove of draft picks to work with, especially back in 1976. However, you can't have a team of nothing but rookies and second-year players. That won't function well. You need locker room guys with experience. You need glue pieces. You need veteran anchors. You need proven players that have done it before, that can mentor the youth, and that know what it's like to play in the NFL. Of course they were going to take older, experienced veterans. That really shouldn't come as a surprise. It was your logic against their logic. And guess what, Paul? Your logic was stupid. Really freaking stupid. But again, this isn't about the Chiefs gambling and completely whiffing and misreading the entire situation regarding the man you've been watching this whole time in Jim Kearney. Rather, this is about the team not even giving him a heads up that this could happen. And sure enough, it does happen, and Kearney is no longer a member of the Chiefs and is forced to leave the team unceremoniously. Remember that episode of SpongeBob where Mr. Krabs loses a game of poker and SpongeBob becomes the property of the chum bucket as a result, completely unbeknownst to SpongeBob? Yeah, that's what this was like. That's what this was freaking like. Because when Kearney found out the news that not only was he left unprotected, but that he was acquired by an expansion team, all while he was never informed of this by his employer for a decade, oh man, he was livid, as just about anyone would be in that spot. Said Kearney, "I'm kind of disappointed, because I wanted to end my career here in Kansas City. I hadn't planned on playing much longer, but I'm a little disappointed I couldn't finish here. It's a weird thing. You play 10 years at Kansas City, and this comes up. At least they could have given me the courtesy of retiring." You could really tell from the second part of that quote that he was ticked off at the extreme lack of courtesy that the Chiefs gave him during all of this, which is to say, no courtesy whatsoever. But just like that, Jim Kearney was no longer a member of the Kansas City Chiefs. After a decade playing there, he was on a brand new team, and he had no idea about it or that this would even be a possibility, because his employer treated him like crap. As for the man who played the bulk of his career with this team behind me right here, Jim Kearney actually never played it down with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 1976. Even though the Buccaneers drafted him in the expansion draft, 3 months later, they would trade his rights to the New Orleans Saints, where he would reunite with his old head coach in Kansas City, Hank Stram. Now, Kearney didn't do much of anything in 1976 with the Saints. He only started one game, making it the first time since 1967 that he did not start all 14 games in a season. And the Saints were terrible that season, and Kearney had no interceptions. He would retire after the 1976 season. However, instead of ending his career in Kansas City, he would end his career with the New Orleans Saints. Funny how that worked out. Look, you can debate whether the Chiefs had an obligation to protect Kearney or not, or whether they should have done so in the first place. That can go either way, and if it was just about that, then I definitely would not be making this video. However, half a century later, it's almost impossible to debate the fact that Jim Kearney deserved better. Throughout his entire pro football career, Jim Kearney deserved better. He deserved better than to find out through the grapevine that he was going to be playing for another team in 1976. He deserved better than to have an employer not even tell him about his job status after being there for a decade and being an anchor in the organization. He deserved better than to never make it to a Pro Bowl or an AFL All-Star game in his career. And he deserved better than to be forgotten about all these years later. In light of his passing, Jim Kearney truly was an exceptional player that deserves to be remembered, even if much of history has forgotten that he existed. And heck, even if the Chiefs in 1976 forgot that he existed, or just didn't care. Jim Kearney was a legend in every sense of the word, especially a Chiefs legend. And even if he didn't get his due over the years, he's getting his due now. Rest in peace to a really, really great safety. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.